Unique for Minnesota consumers and businesses while ensuring an opportunity in this new market for communities that have been most affected by prohibition. Our main goals are to legalize, regulate, and expunge, and this bill does just that. This bill establishes an Office of Cannabis Management to oversee the regulation of cannabis and cannabinoid products and transfers the medical cannabis to this new office. It establishes a Cannabis Advisory Council, requires specific studies and reports, and sets up a statewide monitoring system. The bill also creates an approval process for cannabis products and hemp-derived consumer products, establishes plant propagation standards, and agricultural best practices and environmental standards. Additionally, the bill provides legal limits for adult-use cannabis products, establishes categories of licenses and related fees and legal framework. We establish a social equity program to ensure communities most harmed by prohibition have an opportunity to engage in the industry. We provide grower grants and invest in substance use disorder treatment and recovery, prevention, treatment, and recovery. Senate File 73 sets the tax rate for cannabis products, provides business development grant programs, allows for reasonable levels of local control, sets up automatic expungement programs as well as an expungement panel for higher level offenses, and puts in temporary regulation for the changes that we made last year. We also provide guidelines around testing, packaging, labeling, and advertising. This bill is comprehensive, to say the least. The suggestions and meeting requests related to cannabis began pouring in on day one of the session. My calendar documents 3,325 minutes spent in 109 meetings to work on this bill. We set up an online forum where anyone could submit the recommended changes, and we fielded over 300 suggestions. We hashed out those recommendations together as a body over 30 hours in a marathon of 14 committee hearings. Throughout those hearings, we adopted 65 amendments in a true bipartisan effort. Of those 65 amendments, 22 of them, 1/3, came from my friends across the aisle. Before our second hearing in Commerce, Senator Rasmussen knocked on my door to talk through the amendments he planned to offer, and I accepted 4 of them. They were good ideas. This inspired me to offer time to GOP colleagues before committee hearings to sit down and really discuss how we could improve the bill together. I want to thank Senators Rasmussen, Dames, Duckworth, Anderson, Jasinski, Howe, Lang, Coleman, and Abler for their good faith amendments that helped make this bill the best it can be for all Minnesotans. I also want to thank my DFL colleagues who all but one heard this bill in committee multiple times. Carrying this bill for our caucus has been an incredible honor, and I want to send a special thank you to my buds, Erin Murphy and Claire Umu-Verbaten, who were my co-presenters on several committees so I could chair my own committee. This bill started its journey in Judiciary and Public Safety Committee way back in January. We started in Judiciary because we strongly believe there can be no legalization without expungement. The harm of incarceration has been borne primarily by communities of color, especially Black men, even though in study after study, Black people and white people use cannabis at similar rates. The disproportionate rates of arrest, prosecution, and incarceration in the Black community have had far-reaching effects on employment opportunities, housing, education, family stability, and wealth building, to name just a few. I want to share a story from Tanya. Tanya is the first formerly incarcerated person appointed to the Minnesota Sentencing Guidelines Commission. She wrote to me and talked to me about this and told me her story. At 18, she was charged and convicted of a felony possession of marijuana. She was in an abusive relationship, and her boyfriend at the time, unknown to her, stashed 5 pounds of marijuana in her basement ceiling. That felony conviction set her life on a very rough pathway. This was before Ban the Box, so she was red-lettered as a felon on every job application. She was unable to obtain employment, even at fast food restaurants. She was a young mother and was no longer eligible for public housing. Nor was she eligible for FAFSA due to her conviction, so higher education was out of the question. This set her life on a downward spiral for many years. The constant fight against homelessness, joblessness, and emotional shame. The prohibition of cannabis has harmed not just her life, but her children, who also suffer collateral consequences. Members, we have a responsibility to right this wrong. And Minnesotans are watching, literally. When the House, the other body, passed the companion bill earlier this week, over 2,300 people were tuned into the live stream. Minnesotans are ready. Attitudes are changing. Now is our time to undo decades of ineffective and damaging prohibition. And Mr. President, I have the A8 amendment.
Senator Port offers the what was the number?
8.
A8 amendment. The Secretary will report the A8 amendment.
Senator Port moves to amend House File Number 100, the first unofficial engrossment as follows. Page 56, line 7, before the second 8, insert more than. This is the A8 amendment.
Senator Port, to your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. President and members. This is a technical amendment. Lines 1.3 through 1.6 are suggestions from the reviser. 1.7 through 110 are clearing up suggestions from the Finance Committee last week. 1.13 is fixing an error on the date. Same for 1.19. And the other lines, the sections 1.14 and from 1.22 down to the bottom are all edits to clarify the conversation we had in finance about ensuring that the revolving loans account is set up correctly. I ask for a green vote.
Any other discussions on the A8 amendment? Seeing none, all in favor say aye. All opposed say no. The motion prevails. The A8 is adopted. Senator Hochschild.
Thank you, Mr. President. I offer the A11 amendment.
Senator Hochschild offers the A11 amendment. The Secretary will report the A11 amendment.
Senator Hochschild moves to amend House File Number 100, the first unofficial engrossment as follows. Page 37, line 7, after may, insert. This is the A11 amendment.
Senator Hochschild to your A11 amendment.
Thank you, Mr. President. And before I begin, I ask for a roll call.
Roll call requested, roll call granted. Senator Hochschild.
Thank you, Mr. President. I first want to thank Senator Port for taking into consideration the concerns of local governments throughout this process. I know because I often talk to local governments in my district and have to remind them that the Senate bill is vastly different from the House bill in that regard. I also reflect back on my time as a city councilor and know how important it is that our local communities can make decisions on behalf of their needs. I'm appreciative of the work that Senator Port and Senator Gustafson have done regarding local control throughout this session on this bill. And this amendment specifically focuses on making sure that the zoning authorities of local governments are crystal clear. The A11 amendment would clarify sections 13 and 14 to make sure that we're clear that governments have the ability to utilize their regulatory authorities and place reasonable restrictions related to hours of operation, noise, odor, and location. This amendment also clarifies the local restrictions on number of cannabis retailers, which is an important request from our local governments. This amendment was requested and supported by local government associations representing hundreds of cities from the LMC, as well as 87 counties by AMC, and I ask for your support of this critical local control amendment. Thank you, Mr. President.
Any other discussion on the A11 amendment? Senator Rasmussen.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would Senator Hochschild yield for a question?
Senator Hochschild, will you yield? He will yield. Senator Rasmussen.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Hochschild. Senator Hochschild, could you explain or describe who has seen this language and who is in support of the A11 amendment?
Senator Hochschild to the question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Obviously, the author, Senator Port, has seen this language, as well as AMC and LMC.
Senator Rasmussen.
Thank you, Mr. President.
Any further discussions on the A11 amendment? Senator Port.
Thank you, Mr. President and members. I want to direct you to a letter on your desk as well from LMC and AMC. It's the top letter in the packet that you got. I want to request a green vote for this amendment. This is clarifying language to ensure that our intent, as we have worked over the last few months with the League of Minnesota Cities and the Association of Minnesota Counties, who have been excellent partners in this, is clarified and correct in the way that they need. I support this amendment.
Senator Pratt to the A11.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I continue to be concerned with the preemption of our local governments, our cities and counties, to decide whether they want cannabis in retailers in their jurisdictions or not. And this continues to force cities, while they can say they don't want a vape shop or they don't want a tobacco shop, they cannot deny a similar type of shop that focuses on cannabis. We are stripping away the ability of our local communities to say whether or not they want these establishments or not. Even when Colorado passed this law many, many years ago, they allowed local communities to opt out, to decide whether or not they wanted these retailers in their jurisdiction. And at the time, about 75% of communities decided they didn't want it. Now that's slowly gone back down, and I think we're closer to a 50-50 split in Colorado. But the idea that we are preempting the locals from even deciding whether they want this, when they can do the very same thing for tobacco, they can do the very same thing for liquor, but they have to have cannabis. And I think it's wrong for us to preempt our local jurisdictions, and this just reinforces that preemption.
Any additional discussions on the A11? Who is it? Oh, Senator Nelson. Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have some concerns in that it looks like, looking at the language 37.10, we are eliminating the ability for a local unit of government to prohibit a cannabis business within 500 feet of a school, daycare, or park. That is significant and should bring warning bells to all of us.
Senator Abler.
Thanks, Mr. President. I was somebody talked to me about this yesterday. If you don't like the way the bill is, if it's too restrictive, this makes it less restrictive. So if you want to keep the bill the way it is and worse or make it better, from my point of view, where there's more flexibility, this is that amendment. Thank you.
Any other discussion? Senator Hochschild, you are the author of the amendment. You get the last word.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would just reiterate that this is strongly supported by AMC and LMC. We've had thoughtful conversations. Senator Port has been involved with this since the very beginning of this bill, having these conversations with our local governments. This is the right approach. They approve, and let's vote green. Thank you, Mr. President.
The Secretary will take the roll on the A11 amendment. Members, please vote. Senator Morrison, for those voting under Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Bolden votes aye.
Senator Bolden votes aye.
Senator Dietzig votes aye.
Senator Dietzig votes aye.
Senator Mitchell votes aye.
Senator Mitchell votes aye.
Senator Rest votes aye.
Senator Rest votes aye.
Senator Seeberger votes aye.
Senator Seeberger votes aye. Senator Rest did vote in person. Senator Rasmussen, those voting under Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Barr votes no.
Senator Barr votes no.
Senator Coleman votes no.
Senator Coleman votes no.
Senator Draheim votes no.
Senator Draheim votes no.
Senator Housley votes no.
Senator Housley votes no.
Senator Howe votes no.
Senator Howe votes no.
Senator Lang votes no.
Senator Lang votes no.
Senator Liskey votes no.
Senator Liskey votes no.
Senator Miller votes no.
Senator Miller votes no.
Senator Weber votes no.
Senator Weber votes no.
And Senator Westrom votes aye.
And Senator Westrom votes aye. All having voted who desires to vote, the secretary will close the roll. There have been 38 ayes and 28 noes. The A11 amendment is adopted. Any further amendments? Senator Hochschild.
Thank you, Mr. President. I introduce the A5 amendment.
Senator Hochschild offers the A5 amendment, and the secretary will report the A5 amendment.
Senator Hochschild moves to amend House File Number 100, the first unofficial engrossment as follows. Page 155, line 26, delete 10 and insert 12. This is the A5 amendment.
Senator Hochschild to your A5 amendment.
Thank you, Mr. President. Before I begin, I'd like to ask for a roll call.
Roll call requested, roll call granted. Senator Hochschild.
Thank you, Mr. President. This amendment would increase the gross receipt sales tax from 10% to 12%. And then scale up the tax starting in 2028 by 1% each year until it reaches 20%. The amendment would also increase the local government share of the gross receipts tax from 25% to 30%. As we can see in this bill, there are several areas that we are asking our local governments to assist and partner with us in regards to the legalization of adult use cannabis. Land use and zoning, compliance enforcement, public safety responses, local public health outreach, and education. I know the author has been in routine communication with our local government partners and has already taken many local government concerns into consideration regarding the land use and zoning requests. This revenue would be split equally between counties and cities and largely dedicated by total amount of licenses. We know when looking at the original local cannabis aid amounts with the 10% tax rate that this wouldn't cover the full impacts on local governments, so this is a meaningful recognition of those costs. I believe this is an important amendment that says we hear the concerns brought forward by our cities and counties, see our local governments as partners, and support them as being part of this new industry. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Port to the 11.
Thank you, Mr. President and members. Through this process, I've talked many times, for those of you who've been in committee with me, about the need to keep the tax on cannabis low enough that we don't outprice the illicit market and give an opportunity for that illicit market to keep a foothold. I have worked and want to thank Senator Hochschild for his willingness to work with me on this. I am comfortable with this language, if not enthusiastic, because I do think it gives us some time to get the regulated market up and running before we really increase the tax. So I encourage members to vote their districts on this, how you feel you need to, and want to thank Senator Hochschild for his work on this.
Any other discussion on the A5 amendment? Senator Grutenhagen.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Yeah, it's just interesting to me, members, how we want to keep taxes lower on marijuana because it might negatively affect the industry. Maybe if we applied that to the rest of the state, we might see a faster growth in the private sector. Does seem like a little bit of hypocrisy, although I'll leave it up to each member to decide. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I would like would Senator Hochschild yield, please? A few questions.
Senator Hochschild, will you yield? He will yield. Senator Nelson.
Yes, looking at these amendments on the fly, I just have a couple questions here. Number one, what is the distribution and how are you changing that? I understand the A5 is increasing the tax from 10 to 12%. I'd like to know about the distribution of that additional 2%.
Senator Hochschild, to the question.
Thank you, Mr. President. It's the same distribution as the 2% from 8% to 10%. It just adds on to 12%. And it's distributed by number of licenses equally to county and cities. Overall, it's 30% of the overall gross receipt tax.
Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. President. There also is some language in the bill that, or in your amendment, I'd like you to describe so members have that in front of them. Lines 1.11 through 1.14 on your amendment. What is being deleted, not just the number B, but what language is being deleted and what is being inserted in line 1.11, 1.12, 1.13, and 1.14.
Senator Hauschild to the question.
Thank you, Mr. President and Senator Nelson. So some of the lines that you're describing just reorder some of the lettering, and then the other change is just changing and clarifying that now that we're going up to 12%, the local governments will get 30% from 25% of the local gross receipts tax.
Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. President, and Senator Hauschild. And then on line...
Are you asking him to continue to yield?
Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Hauschild, will you yield? He will yield. Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. President. And then for clarity for the body, what is being deleted? 75 is now being replaced with 70. Senator Hauschild.
Senator Hauschild.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Nelson. So again, what we're doing here is we are increasing the tax, the gross receipts tax, from 10% to 12%, and that paragraph, the lines that you are describing, further clarifies that the local governments will then get, the general fund that's not going to local governments will get 70% rather than 75%, because the local governments will now get 30%.
Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. President. And one final question, if the senator would yield, please.
Will you yield? He will yield. Senator Nelson.
Thank you. So the genesis of these questions is I would like to know in total if the ratio is changing. So in other words, the 2%, the added 2% tax, I want to know, is it continuing to be distributed as in the bill prior to this A5 amendment? Or you may have answered this, is one entity getting less of the additional 2%, or the additional 2%? Just describe how that is being distributed, please.
Senator Hauschild.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Nelson. The formula is staying the same before the amendment. However, local governments will now get more money as a overall percentage because of the taxes increasing. I hope that answers your question.
Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. President, and Senator Hauschild. I appreciate that. I needed to know that regarding the formula. Thank you.
Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would Senator Hauschild yield for a question?
Senator Hauschild, will you yield? He will yield. Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Hauschild. And I apologize, a few numbers and percentages be thrown around, so the question's fairly simple. What is the maximum tax threshold that this amendment would allow for as it relates to taxing cannabis?
Senator Hauschild.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Duckworth. The gross receipts tax would eventually have a maximum tax of 20%.
Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator Hauschild. I appreciate that, and I would direct members' attention to a letter in our packets from Americans for Prosperity. Toward the end of that letter in bold, they state that studies show that the legal market can only compete up to a taxable threshold of 15% before consumers divert their business to the illicit market. And so I think, other than the mentioned by Senator Gruenhagen earlier, as it relates to taxes and keeping them low, I think there might be another reason or another discussion regarding tax rates and how we might approach the taxing of cannabis here in the state, and whether or not we allow it to get up to 20%. I think states like California serve as a good example for this. The business of doing cannabis in that state has become so expensive that some reports estimate that only 20% of the cannabis market there is actually being conducted legally, and that 80% is being conducted in the illicit market because the costs, whether it's to get a license or the taxes involved, are so expensive and burdensome that it's forcing a lot of folks into the illicit market. So, Mr. President, I'll wrap up by saying, we're going to continue to have a conversation and debate regarding the legalization of cannabis and such, but we have to be mindful and learn lessons from other states that if the state of Minnesota approaches this and makes it so expensive and so costly and adds so much tax to it, that we might have the unintended consequence of exacerbating that illicit market even more, which we know is not going to go away entirely. Thank you.
Senator Umu Verbatim.
Thank you, Mr. President. I don't support this amendment. I believe that the tax rate on this bill is very important to get right. We want to make sure that we're moving from an illicit marketplace that we currently have to a regulated one, and that the tax rate is helping us create that new regulated market, that it's paying for that. We need to make sure that our local municipalities have funds as well to do that enforcement, and Senator Port has taken those amendments throughout this committee process to ensure that we have those funds. This is too high, and frankly, I believe anything higher needs to go directly to the communities most harmed. That's the reason why I got on this bill, is to make sure primarily communities of color who have been harmed by the prohibition on cannabis are able to benefit when we create this new marketplace. So I encourage members to vote no on the amendment.
Senator Dornick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was wondering if Senator Hofstad would yield for a question.
Senator Hofstad, will you yield? He will yield. Senator Dornick.
Thank you, Senator Hofstad. Well, my question is, does this apply to hemp and cannabinoid realtors also, this increase the tax?
Senator Hofstad, did you hear the question? Senator Hofstad.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Dornick. Yes.
Senator Dornick.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Hofstad.
Senator Rasmussen.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I think this amendment brings up actually an important factor around the debate today, which is I believe we don't yet have a local impact for this bill. We don't know what the ultimate cost is going to be for local units of government. And I think this amendment brought by Senator Hauschild is an acknowledgement that there will be additional costs for local units of government. But at least as far as I know, we haven't received any detailed analysis on what that cost would be. And so I think this is another reason why we're not ready for this bill today. And you can pick a number, but without the information on what this is actually going to cost local units of government, I don't think this fixes their problems.
Senator Aaron May-Quate.
Thank you, Mr. President, and I really just want to reiterate what Senator Umu Verbatim said. In 1994, John Ehrlichman, who was President Nixon's domestic policy advisor, he admitted in an interview that they couldn't make it illegal to be black or to be against the war, but we could get the public to associate blacks and hippies with marijuana and heroin, and we could criminalize both heavily. We could disrupt their meetings and their communities. We could arrest their leaders. We could raid their homes, and we could vilify them night after night after night on the news. And so when Senator Umu Verbatim talks about if we're going to have more money come from the taxation on adult use cannabis, the harm that was caused, the costs, if you want to talk about human costs, are those communities that were disrupted, the people who were vilified night after night after night on the news. He ended by saying, did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. And so we have in front of us a bill to try to repair that harm. And if we're going to have more money come out from the taxes of the adult use cannabis, it should go to repairing that harm. So I encourage a no vote on this. Thank you so much, Mr. President.
Senator Nelson. Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would Senator Marty yield for a question?
Senator Marty, will you yield? He will yield. Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Marty, a local impact note has been requested, and according to Senator Hauschild, this is supposed to help cover the costs that cities and counties will incur. Can you tell me, based on that local impact note, whether or not this is enough to cover those costs?
Senator Marty, to the question.
Mr. President, Senator Pratt, I have not seen that. As you know, those local impact statements take a long time. I think Senator Hauschild is saying he believes there are costs. We know there are costs of any decisions we make here, and he's trying to do what he thinks is a fair balance of how we cover those costs.
Senator Pratt.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator Marty. Well, I think we've heard the answer. We've requested a local impact note. We've asked for empirical data to say what the cost that will be incurred by our local cities and counties will be, so that we can set an appropriate tax rate, so we can set an appropriate distribution. Senator Hochschild amendment is no better than what we've got in the existing bill. It's just hopes and wishes that we cover it. For some reason, the majority is putting their head in the sand when it comes to the real costs that are going to be absorbed by our local communities. They're not waiting for that local impact note to come back to tell us what the real impact, what the real costs are going to be. I'm quite honestly torn on this, Mr. President, because I'd like to see our cities and counties get more money, but yet we still don't have any empirical evidence that this is enough, this is the right distribution. It's just all hopes and wishes.
The last voice we'll hear is that of Senator Hochschild, who is the author of the Senator Muhammad.
Sorry, Mr. President. Senator Pratt is really tall, so he was blocking me. Some of us are voting on this bill today. First of all, to what Senator Rasmussen said earlier, which is this bill is not ready, that is not correct. This bill is ready and has been ready for a long time. It is long overdue. And to the amendment, I'm with Senator Umu Verbieten and Senator McQuaid on this. I will be voting no. And that is because there's been a harm that's been done for decades, and we haven't done that. We have not undone the harm. I understand why Senator Hochschild brought this forward, and yes, our counties and our cities should be able to benefit from this, but it should be our communities who should be benefiting this first, and I think this is really regressive.
Senator Hochschild will have the last word on the A5 amendment. Senator Hochschild.
Thank you, Mr. President. I appreciate Senator Duckworth's comments in particular regarding this amendment. Part of the reason the way this amendment is drafted is to help the market get established. And so the increase in the tax from 12% would not start until 2028, which I think would be helpful in stamping out the illicit market. In addition to that, part of the reason that we have seen the illicit market thrive in other states is because they prohibit it in certain localities. So this is really a balanced approach to giving our local communities that local control that they've been asking for through their associations, but also having a process for which the tax increases when the industry is better established. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Rasmussen.
Thank you, Mr. President. Parliamentary inquiry. Has a roll call been requested on this?
A roll call has been requested.
Thank you.
Members, the Secretary will take the roll on the A5 amendment. Members, please vote. Senator Morrison, for those voting under Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Bolden votes no.
Senator Bolden votes no.
Senator Dietzick votes no.
Senator Dietzick votes no.
Senator Mitchell votes no.
Senator Mitchell votes no.
Let me start over, Mr. President. Senator Bolden votes aye.
Senator Bolden votes aye.
Senator Dietzick votes aye.
Senator Dietzick votes aye.
Senator Mitchell votes aye.
Senator Mitchell votes aye.
Senator Seeberger votes aye.
Senator Seeberger votes aye. Members, please vote. Members, Senator Rasmussen, for those voting under Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Barr votes no.
Senator Barr votes no.
Senator Coleman votes no.
Senator Coleman votes no.
Senator Draheim votes no.
Senator Draheim votes no.
Senator Housley votes no.
Senator Housley votes no.
Senator Howe votes no.
Senator Howe votes no.
Senator Lang votes no.
Senator Lang votes no.
Senator Liskey votes no.
Senator Liskey votes no.
Senator Miller votes no.
Senator Miller votes no.
Senator Weber votes no.
Senator Weber votes no.
And thank you, Mr. President. Senator Westrom votes no.
And Senator Westrom votes no. Senator Anderson, are you planning to vote? Senator Pratt? All senators having voted who desires to vote, the secretary will close the roll. There have been 27 ayes and 37 noes. The A5 amendment is not adopted. Members, any additional amendments?
Mr. President.
Senator Johnson.
Move to lay the bill on the table. And a roll call requested.
That is a non-debatable motion. And did you request a roll call?
Yes.
Roll call requested, a roll call granted. The secretary would take the roll on the motion to lay the bill on the table. Members, please vote. Senator Morrison, for those voting under Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Bolden votes no.
Senator Bolden votes no.
Senator Dietzick votes no.
Senator Dietzick votes no.
Senator Mitchell votes no.
Senator Mitchell votes no.
Senator Seeberger votes no.
Senator Seeberger votes no. Senator Rasmussen, those voting under Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Barr votes aye.
Senator Barr votes aye.
Senator Coleman votes aye.
Senator Coleman votes aye.
Senator Draheim votes aye.
Senator Draheim votes aye.
Senator Housley votes aye.
Senator Housley votes aye.
Senator Howe votes aye.
Senator Howe votes aye.
Senator Lang votes aye.
Senator Lang votes aye.
Senator Liskey votes aye.
Senator Liskey votes aye.
Senator Miller votes aye.
Senator Miller votes aye.
Senator Weber votes aye.
Senator Weber votes aye.
Senator Westrom votes aye.
And Senator Westrom votes aye.
And thank you, Mr. President. Senator Jaskowski votes aye.
Senator Jaskowski votes aye. All senators having voted who desires to vote, the secretary will close the roll. There have been 33 ayes and 34 noes. The motion to lay the bill on the table fails. Any additional amendments? Senator Hochschild.
Thank you, Mr. President. I introduce the A2 amendment.
Senator Hochschild offers the A2 amendment. The secretary will report the A2 amendment.
Senator Hochschild moves to amend House File Number 100, the first unofficial engrossment as follows. Page 294, line 32, delete 13,987,000 and insert. This is the A2 amendment.
Senator Hochschild, to your A2 amendment.
Thank you, Mr. President. This amendment would appropriate $10 million in the first year and $5 million in the second year from the general fund for drug evaluation and classification program for drug recognition, additional phlebotomists, drug recognition training for peace officers as defined in Minnesota Statute 626.84. And I ask for a roll call.
Roll call requested, roll call granted. Any additional discussions on the A2 amendment? Senator Nelson.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. I did not hear where this additional $10 million is coming from. So, Senator from Hermantown, where's the $10 million coming from? Our bills have to balance on the Senate floor here.
Senator Nelson, I naturally assume that you're requesting through the president whether Senator Hochschild will yield. Are you asking if he will yield?
Yes, Mr. President.
Senator Hochschild, will you yield? He will yield. Did you hear the question, Senator Hochschild? He did. Senator Hochschild, to the question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Nelson. This is a general fund appropriation.
Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm just a little stunned that we're just having a general fund appropriation added in an amendment on the Senate floor. Perhaps Senator Marty could yield and explain where that general fund $10 million has been hiding until today.
Senator Marty is not on the floor. If you have a motion, Senator Nelson, I'll be happy to entertain it. Do you have a rule that you want to cite?
Mr. President?
Yes, Senator Nelson.
I will find the rule for you, and we will cite it. This is unprecedented to have a $10 million general fund expense show up in an amendment without being paid for. Let me find the rule, Mr. President.
Senator Port.
Thank you, Mr. President and members. I encourage a yes vote on this. Having talked with law enforcement and Senator Hochschild, this is an additional investment in the drug recognition officers to help make sure that our roads are as safe as they can be. I encourage a yes vote.
Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would Senator Hochschild yield for a question?
Senator Hochschild, will you yield? He will yield. Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Hochschild. I think I appreciate the amendment, what it's trying to accomplish. Looks like it's funding for drug evaluation experts and training, drug classification, police officer training, etc. And I'm just wondering why we might need to increase funding for police officers, drug evaluations, and drug recognition experts in regard to this bill.
Senator Hochschild, to the question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Duckworth. As we know, there is evaluations that are being studied and looked into when it comes to cannabis. So this is in part helpful for that. This is also a direct appropriation to public safety professionals in addition to some of the local government aid that is provided in this bill to help with bringing this new industry to our state.
Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator Hochschild. I think this amendment proves a very important topic of the debate we're going to have today, which is the bill, admittedly, based on some of the conversation we've just had and based on the amendment being brought forward, is not ready. We just heard that evaluations are ongoing and that we need funding to continue more evaluations of cannabis, its effects on people, how it may impair their driving ability, and for police officers to determine whether or not somebody is impaired or inebriated if they're under the influence of marijuana. Furthermore, it was just acknowledged that public safety is going to need more funding to actually do their job. Well, why in the world would public safety need more funding? Why would we need more funding for cannabis evaluation and drug experts if this bill isn't going to have a negative impact on public safety, if this bill isn't going to have a negative impact on traffic incidents and fatalities? If we know exactly what kind of impact cannabis is going to have on people, why are we still passing funding in this amendment to evaluate it, to train law enforcement officers on how to detect it, funding for drug experts? Folks, here's the deal. We can continue to try to make improvements on this bill and continue the trajectory of the state of Minnesota making subtle increases and changes to the legalization of cannabis in our state as we have over the years. But for those that would suggest that this bill is ready because it has been through however many committees, are admitting with this amendment, if they vote for it, that it's not ready. There's still plenty of work to be done here. This isn't something that we should be rushing to, and it leads me to ask the question, are we passing good policy, or is this an attempt to pass what somebody thinks is good politics, Mr. President? That's what's at issue here. And if we are saying that we need more money and funding for public safety and drug experts and evaluations, then that's a clear sign this bill is not ready to be rolled out statewide. Thank you.
Senator Nelson.
Thank you, Mr. President. It does not appear that this is an omnibus bill, which is not limited to a set amount. So technically, this bill, we could add any cost we want to this bill, which maybe we should think about doing. What I would say is that the items that are mentioned in the middle part of this amendment are things that our law enforcement has been asking for since the bill first made its appearance. And so it is rather shocking that these have not been addressed. These things have not been addressed in all of the committees that it's gone through so far. And so while I definitely support the need for these things, the challenge is this bill is not ready. Why was this fundamental need to talk about drug evaluation and classification? Why was that not an essential part of legalizing marijuana? Additional phlebotomists, drug recognition training, and peace officers. We've been talking about that for months and months and months, and yet it shows up on the Senate floor as an amendment. And to make matters worse, members, do you know what? This is not just funded from the general fund. Read to the bottom of the amendment, members, and you will see that it is taking money out of the highway fund. The fund that we talked about yesterday, where we had so many needs for safety. And now because this bill is not, it's premature, it has not been thought through. One of the main pieces of essential things has been drug evaluation and drug recognition testing, and here it comes with not enough funding, and so we rob it out of the highway fund. Members, this bill is not baked yet.
Senator Jasinski.
Thank you, Mr. President, and Senator Hochschild. Again, a concern as the lead on transportation. I know Senator Newman, we've always talked about leakages, and we want our highway money going to roads and bridges. And this is concerning. I think it was in the bill already, but I guess I'm a little bit confused on the A2. Does it take more money from the trunk highway fund as the original bill does? So Senator Hochschild would answer that question or yield for a question.
Senator Hochschild, will you yield? He will yield. Senator Jasinski.
Thank you, Mr. President. So, Senator Hochschild, does this take more money that was in the original bill from trunk highway funds? And can you explain what the difference is, or is this just general fund?
Senator Hochschild, to the question. If you need a couple more minutes, Senator Hochschild, or a second, are you okay?
No, Mr. President, thank you. I can answer.
Okay, Senator Hochschild.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Jasinski. This does take it from the general fund.
Senator Jasinski.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Hochschild, for confirming that. Again, we already have enough money taken out of trunk highway fund, so that is good to know that does not come more from there. But again, I think the question of the overall bill, if this does pass, does this improve public safety in Minnesota? And I don't think there's anybody I've heard from law enforcement that says this bill will improve our public safety. This is costing us more money in training and patrolling and testing, and less money going towards our roads and bridges. So I would vote no on this amendment.
The last person to be heard, Senator Kuhn.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would Senator Hochschild yield? Would Senator Hochschild yield?
Oh, Senator Hochschild, will you yield? He will yield. Senator Kroon.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Hochschild, I guess I'm confused by your answer. If you could help us explain what lines 1.16 and 1.17 are in your amendment, what that means. That says that 6.157 million the first year and 2.218 million second year are from trunk highway funds. So you say it's coming from the general fund. I guess if you could just help explain that for me.
Senator Hochschild, to the question.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Kroon. In the original bill from the general fund, that is the fund that it was appropriated to, so we're just adding it back in with an additional amount to that fund from the general fund.
Senator Kroon.
Thank you, Mr. President. Well, I'm not going to go through my whole speech that I did yesterday on Highway 65 and the importance of funds that we need for trunk highways to actually improve trunk highways. If this bill is diverting any money from the trunk highway fund to pay for this bill, then that would be very disappointing with so many needs, so many needs on our trunk highways right now, particularly in my district. The quality of life is being affected, and we're diverting trunk highway funds from what we should be using it for, which is improving our trunk highways, to this. It's very concerning. Thank you, Mr. President.
Any additional discussion before I go to the bill, the amendment author? Seeing none, Senator Hochschild, you have the last word on the A2 amendment.
Thank you, Mr. President. I think we've talked about this enough, so I just ask members to vote green. Thank you.
The secretary will take the roll. Members, please vote. Senator Morrison, for those voting under Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Bolden votes aye.
Senator Bolden votes aye.
Senator Dietzig votes aye.
Senator Dietzig votes aye.
Senator Mitchell votes aye.
Senator Mitchell votes aye.
Senator Seeberger votes aye.
Senator Seeberger votes aye. Senator Rasmussen, for those voting under Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Barr votes no.
Senator Barr votes no.
Senator Coleman votes no.
Senator Coleman votes no.
Senator Draheim votes no.
Senator Draheim votes no.
Senator Housley votes no.
Senator Housley votes no.
Senator Howe votes no.
Senator Howe votes no.
Senator Lang votes no.
Senator Lang votes no.
Senator Liskey votes no.
Senator Liskey votes no.
Senator Miller votes no.
Senator Miller votes no.
Senator Weber votes no.
Senator Weber votes no.
And Senator Westrom votes no.
And Senator Westrom votes no. All senators having voted who desires to vote, the secretary will close the roll. There being 35 ayes and 30 noes, the A2 amendment is adopted. Any additional amendments? Senator Hoffman?
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the A13 amendment.
You have the what?
A13 amendment.
Senator Hoffman offers the A13 amendment. The secretary will report the A13 amendment.
Senator Hoffman moves to amend House File Number 100, the first unofficial engrossment as follows. Page 296, line 19, delete $4 million and insert. This is the A13 amendment.
Senator Hoffman, if you'd be so kind as to talk about your A13 amendment.
Thank you, Mr. President. I sure would. It has to do with the 1994 Grammys. So, Mr. President and members, what you have is the conversation that we have in this space. We had set aside money for prevention, treatment, and recovery. All this does is it moves, instead of the $4 million, it turns that to $5,500,000, and then does one other line that moves that to $5,500,000. Addiction is addiction is addiction. And when you're setting something up, we wanted to make sure that there's a base in place. I sure hope the author takes this as a friendly amendment, and please vote yes.
Senator Port.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Hoffman, looking at this, I know your passion for this area, and I appreciate your work on this. I am willing to accept this as friendly.
Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. President. Would Senator Hoffman yield for a question?
Senator Hoffman, will you yield? He will yield. Senator Duckworth, and if you'd be so kind, Senator Duckworth, to bring that mic up. Senator Duckworth.
Will do, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator Hoffman. It's a friendly question. I just want to make sure I understand the amendment correctly. The amendment, does it call for an increased amount of funding for treatment, prevention, and recovery?
Senator Hoffman, to the question.
Thank you, Mr. President, and to the good senator from the southern part of the metro area, the answer is yes, but it doesn't take and move the target. So thank you.
Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Senator Hoffman. I greatly appreciate that, and it goes without saying that there are a few in the Minnesota Senate that have such a commitment to helping those in need as it relates to things like prevention, treatment, and recovery, as Senator Hoffman. And again, I would just point out to the body what these amendments are telling us about the impact of passing this bill. If we are passing or adding amendments to the bill to increase funding for things like law enforcement, to increase funding for things like drug evaluation, if we're passing amendments to increase funding like things for the prevention, treatment, and recovery of substance use or abuse, what does that tell us about the very bill that's before this body? We are continuing to counter every argument being brought forward to justify this bill with amendments from the very party that's seeking to push it through. I'm finding it hard to follow the logic because there are so many contradictions in the conversation and the debate we're having here today, which only goes to prove this is not ready for the people of Minnesota. Let's take the time to get this right, Mr. President. Thank you.
Senator Port.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask for a roll call.
Roll call requested, roll call granted. Senator Rasmussen.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I appreciate Senator Hoffman offering this amendment to give us a chance to talk about the impact that this bill is going to have on substance use disorder in the state of Minnesota. When we had this bill before the Senate Human Services Committee, one of the questions that we asked of the Department of Human Services was, as a part of their fiscal note, which I believe was pending at the time, would they be analyzing the secondary effects that this bill would have on substance use disorder in the state of Minnesota? And their answer at the time was no. I don't think that answer has changed. And so again, this bill is before the body without a thorough analysis that's done on what the cost will be to the state of Minnesota, to local units of governments, and to families who will be facing substance use disorder. And Mr. President and members, I think, and we'll talk about this perhaps later, this is going to be not just allowing cannabis dispensaries to be open, allowing retailers to be open, but the low potency licensure in this bill could be putting cannabis products on the menu at bars and restaurants. It could be putting cannabis products in our grocery stores and convenience stores and exposing millions of Minnesotans to cannabis products who are not specifically seeking it out. And so I don't think this amendment is going to cover the increased cost in substance use disorder. And we don't even know what those costs will be because the work hasn't been done before bringing this bill to the floor today to understand the true costs it will have on the state of Minnesota.
Senator Murphy.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, members. Prohibition does not mean that people aren't using cannabis. What it means is that people are using cannabis that is growing less safe, and people are getting hurt. When we regulate the use of cannabis by making it legal, the product will be safer. People will use it as they are now, and people who use it and need support because of substance abuse disorder will get that help. Making cannabis legal doesn't mean more people are going to use it or less people are going to use it. We know people are using it today. The Hoffman Amendment means there's more access to support, and that's important. But I think we have to open our eyes to the fundamental fact that people are using cannabis today. What we are doing with this legislation is legalizing it, regulating it, making it more safe, and getting people more help. So if we want people to be safe, this is the path. Thank you.
Senator Gruenhagen.
Well, thank you, Mr. President. Yeah, thank you, Senator Hoffman, for bringing an increase in funding for the addiction. And I think it shows one of the fallacies of this bill. You know, having done jail ministry for 13 years, I've seen a lot of addiction. And what addiction does, you lose the ability to make a decision on whether you want to use or have something. You have to have it, and you'll do almost anything, crime or otherwise, in order to get it. And the more addiction we promote, the more problems we get. I have a good friend who about 10 years ago moved out to Colorado, where it is legal. And I talked to him about 2 weeks ago about the consequences out there. Number one, they don't receive near enough revenue for all the negative consequences that come out of legalization. In fact, he said it's somewhere in the neighborhood of about 7 to 8 to 1 negative. $1 of tax revenue to $7 to $8 of negative consequences. Number two, if we look at homelessness, we know based on that a lot of those people are addicted to illegal drugs or having drug-type problems. You know, when I was when I did jail ministry, one of the things I usually ask the prisoners was, I said, how many of you were on excessive alcohol or illegal drugs or both when you got arrested? About 95% of them raised their hand, okay? So when you use mind-altering and emotion-altering drugs, it does have an effect, especially when you put it with addiction. I have to quote one thing from our Liberty Bell in Independence Hall here in the United States. The quote on the bell is, "Proclaim liberty throughout the land unto all the inhabitants thereof." What this bill does, it proclaims addiction and exploitation throughout the land. It's not ready for prime time. Even people who support legalization don't support this bill. It's got a lot of flaws. It should go back to committee and have major reworks. And we can see that by the number of amendments that come forward and where they're targeting this bill, which still leaves a lot to be desired. So members, I encourage you to vote green on this amendment by Senator Hoffman, but the bill itself is taking us in the wrong direction. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Jasinski.
Thank you, Mr. President. I do thank Senator Hoffman for thinking of this, but again, I want to respond to the senator from St. Paul saying people are using it. Absolutely, yes, they are here in Minnesota. But this bill is just going to make it more accessible to our children, to more people. We're going to create more issues. And secondly, if you think the illegal market is going to go away because we're legalizing it, I'm sorry, that is not correct. Illegal activity, the cartels are not going to stop operating. They're going to continue to try and sell. It's going to happen. If you think legalizing this will stop that, it will not.
Senator Hoffman is the author of the amendment. He gets the last word if he has anything else he wants to say. Senator Hoffman, he has no other words. The secretary will take the roll on the A13 amendment. Members, please vote. Senator Morrison, for those voting under Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Bolden votes aye.
Senator Bolden votes aye.
Senator Dietzig votes aye.
Senator Dietzig votes aye.
Senator Mitchell votes aye.
Senator Mitchell votes aye.
And Senator Seeberger votes aye.
Senator Seeberger votes aye. Members, please vote, and remember, you're not supposed to be at other members' desks talking. Senator Rasmussen, those voting under Rule 40.7.
Thank you, Mr. President. Senator Barr votes no.
Senator Barr votes no.
Senator Coleman votes aye.
Senator Coleman votes aye.
Senator Draheim votes aye.
Senator Draheim votes aye.
Senator Housley votes aye.
Senator Housley votes aye.
Senator Howe votes aye.
Senator Howe votes aye.
Senator Lang votes aye.
Senator Lang votes aye.
Senator Liskey votes aye.
Senator Liskey votes aye.
Senator Miller votes aye.
Senator Miller votes aye.
Senator Weber votes aye.
Senator Weber votes aye.
And thank you, Mr. President. Senator Westrom votes aye.
And Senator Westrom votes aye. All senators having voted who desires to vote, the secretary will close the roll. There have been 65 ayes and 1 no. The A13 amendment is adopted. Any additional amendments? Senator Duckworth.
Mr. President, I don't have an amendment. I'm just wondering if the bill's author would yield for a question.
Senator, she will yield. Senator Duckworth.
Thank you,
and members, if I can just remind you, it's kind of hard to hear up here, so if you're not talking directly in your mic, I have difficulty hearing you. So I'm sorry if I just keep reminding you of that by putting my hand up to my mouth. That's just to remind you. So thank you, Senator Duckworth.
No, thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator Port. You know, much of the discussion today, and I'm sure much of the discussion that occurred in committee, had to do with looking at other states that had legalized cannabis, whether it varies from this bill, but in principle is somewhat similar, and trying to learn some lessons from what has happened in those states since cannabis was legalized. And I know that that's obviously something that many of us are concerned about or may have questions about here in the state of Minnesota. What potentially would happen? So my question is this. I'm just curious if anywhere in the bill it calls for a study that would look at any increases or changes to things such as public safety and crime rates, traffic incidents and fatalities, use by minors and those under 21, any negative impacts on mental health, and the impact the bill has on the illicit market. That's the question, Mr. President.
Senator Port, are you ready? Senator Port, to the question.
Thank you, Mr. President and Senator Duckworth. Yes, if you look at page 250.1, it talks about a baseline survey that we are doing to understand current levels so that through the studies that we do as legalization progresses, we will learn both about traffic, about usage. We are planning to study underage usage now and after legalization so that we understand the impacts through this process. There are multiple studies in this bill that do exactly that.
Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Senator Port. I greatly appreciate that. Would she yield for one more question?
Senator Port will yield. Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. President and Senator Port. I greatly appreciate you having that in the bill. I think a baseline study of where we are and how this is going to impact the state and the citizens of our state is extremely important. The question I have is, does anywhere in the bill it say what will happen or how the results of said study will be utilized to impact or change laws? So really what I'm asking is, if we are finding very significant negative and detrimental impacts regarding public safety, regarding traffic and traffic fatalities, regarding the use, especially the use of minors or those under the age of 21. If we're seeing a sharp increase in mental health issues as a result of this study, does that then, in a part of this bill, require the legislature to make changes that would protect and safeguard our citizens? Thank you.
Senator Port, to the question.
Thank you, Mr. President and Senator Duckworth. I have sort of two answers to that question. First, I'll say no, there aren't specified changes that we have to make based on results of a study that we don't know what the results will be, because we don't know what the results will be. So we can't make responsible plans for how to potentially make those changes. However, those reports are required to be delivered to the legislature for us to study and look at. They're also required to be delivered to the Office of Cannabis Management, which has some rulemaking ability around the number of licenses, around requirements around potency that the Office of Cannabis Management is allowed to make in reasonable ways based on science and safety. So there are many opportunities. The numbers or the studies are sent back to both the Office of Cannabis Management and the legislature to ensure that we have the information. What we do with it after that, Senator Duckworth, is up to us.
Senator Duckworth.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Port. I greatly appreciate it. And I couldn't agree with you more with the very last thing you said. In the future, whoever that legislature happens to be, if we get the results of this study and they show that this maybe hasn't played out or had the impacts that we thought it might, if it shows negative impacts to things like public safety, traffic fatalities, use of minors, mental health, etc., I can only hope that then the legislature takes action to correct or modify or add some safety measures if that study shows and proves that they're necessary and required. Thank you.
Senator Grudenhagen.
Oh, thank you, Mr. President. If Senator Port would yield for a question.
Senator Port, will you yield? She will yield. Senator Grudenhagen.
Oh, thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Port. Say, one of the contradictions when I read the summary here is that we're going to allow the advertisement of legalized marijuana in our state. And yet, what seems to be a contradiction is when it comes to tobacco, we ban the advertisement of tobacco products here in the state. So, you know, does that seem like a contradiction to you also, Senator Port?
Senator Port, to the question.
Thank you, Mr. President. There are significant restrictions on advertising on, I'll find the page. There are significant restrictions on advertising, including what the advertising can look like. There's no television advertising required. It's much closer to how we, it's much more restrictive to how we allow the advertisement of alcohol, which is what we originally looked at. And it's on page 137, Senator Grudenhagen. We did put significant restrictions on them, and in fact, some of the loosening of those restrictions was in response to a member from an amendment from your caucus that I accepted.
Senator Grudenhagen.
Oh, thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Senator Port, for that response. But it just seems to me we should treat it like tobacco. You know, again, I had that close friend out in Colorado, and he just says the smell of that marijuana smoking is very difficult to deal with for people who don't use and for people who don't smoke. Also, it's a negative influence on our children. So, Senator Port, when you go to conference committee, if this were to pass, hopefully it doesn't, I would just ask that you would restrict it to the same level that we restrict tobacco products. At least that would give some type of measure of help to the citizenry in the state of Minnesota. Thank you, Mr. President.
Senator Kunis for a motion to recess.
Thank you, Mr. President. I do request a recess to be returned upon the call of the President.
To that motion, all in favor say aye. All those opposed say no. The motion prevails. The Senate is now in recess.
Senate Republicans will caucus in 323.